Welcome to our second lecture of the week as we head down the home stretch of the 1920s by taking a look at a couple of related topics, nativism and the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, the second incarnation, if you will, of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s and the rise and fall of that organization during the 1920s. So, without further ado, let's begin today's lecture. So, in the early 1920s, as the decade begins, America is trying to return to a sense of normalcy, as Warren Harding articulated during the 1920 presidential campaign in the aftermath of World War I, which of course ended in the fall of 1918, and the complicated peace process at the Treaty of Versailles finally concluded in the summer of 1919. Of course, there was the Red Summer of racial violence in America in 1919 that we talked about last week. And there was also the Red Scare in Russia as the Tsarist government was overthrown and Russia became a communist country by 1920. So, as you might imagine, there was a bit of trepidation, I guess, for lack of a better term, throughout America as the 20s begin. Particularly with regard to foreign-born American immigrants from countries in Eastern and Southern Europe. Those were countries that at this time were places where socialism and communism and anarchism and other types of radical political philosophies were prevalent and gaining steam, gaining popularity, if you will. And so Americans, a large section of America was, of the American populace was concerned about the immigrants in the U.S. who were from those countries like Italy, countries like the Czech Republic today, Poland, obviously Russia. Those were countries that Americans whose families had been here for generations and had originally come to the U.S. from Western Europe, and particularly from the U.K. or France. They were suspicious of these immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, many of whom had arrived in America since the 1890s, and particularly late 1890s and throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So they were relatively new to America, and the multi-generational American families at this point viewed them with suspicion. Where do your loyalties lie? That kind of thing. A good percentage of America's industrial workers in the 1920s were foreign-born immigrants, many of which came from the countries in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe that were places that drew the suspicion of older American families. More than half of white men working in factories and in industrial jobs in urban America during this time, and approximately a third of white women who worked in these jobs were from these regions in Europe. So this was not an insignificant number of Americans who were relatively new citizens to the country who had family ties and ancestry to Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and parts of Central Europe, where, as I mentioned earlier, radical political activism and political philosophies were taking root to a certain degree. There was one major example, a case in a trial that captured the imagination of Americans during the first half of the 20s, and it involved individuals from this part of Europe who were political radicals, and as a result of this sort of case, devolved into a spectacle for nativism and anti-racial or anti-radical prejudice, I should say. And that was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo. I'm going to get this name right. Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were Italian-American immigrants in Massachusetts in 1920. They were arrested in May of that year and charged with the robbery and killing of a paymaster and a guard at a factory in Massachusetts. When they were arrested, both men were armed, and they were subsequently identified by eyewitnesses. Sacco was a shoemaker. Vanzetti sold fish. So basically just ordinary American immigrants trying to make a living. But neither man denied being active in terms of political activism, and basically they both admitted that they were political radicals. And the judge in their case was anti-radical, and some believed that colored his judgment to the point where they didn't get a fair trial. The two men were convicted and sentenced to death, but a lengthy appeals process followed and ultimately lasted for 7 years. During this time, this case drew attention all over the U.S. and in Europe as well, and liberals and other Americans and Europeans who were maybe not radical, but certainly didn't discriminate amongst radical political activists. This group of people basically rallied behind Sacco and Vanzetti, arguing that they were being punished and executed for their political beliefs, not for the crime that they were alleged to have committed. They argued that the two men didn't get a fair trial. Ultimately, both men were executed in the summer of 1927. Vanzetti was able to succinctly describe the reasons why the two men were put to death shortly before he died. He said, quote, "I am suffering because I am a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian." There have been several investigations since the death of these two men, and it's been determined through these investigations that they more than likely were guilty of the crimes they were charged with, but that then opens the question of whether or not they got a fair trial, or whether or not execution was the appropriate penalty for the crimes they committed. And certainly you could argue that it was, you could argue that it wasn't, but it was it was one of the very first trials of the century that periodically took place, or trials of the decade. This happened before the Scopes trial of 1925 that we discussed earlier this week, but it was a national headline generator nonetheless, and it split Americans on both sides as whether you felt that these men were being unfairly persecuted by the American judiciary system and law enforcement, or whether these two men were guilty of robbery and murder and were deserving of execution by the state. This was something that really put a spotlight on nativism in America and a prejudice toward people with radical political beliefs. And it should be noted that there were other violent acts of violence in the first 2 decades involving political radicals in the U.S. William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. He was president of the United States by an avowed anarchist. There had also been some violence on Wall Street in 1920, along the same lines in terms of some political radicals trying to protest Wall Street and the financial system of America at the time, capitalism in America. So that was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. It really kind of highlighted the nativism that was prevalent in America throughout the 1920s, particularly the first half of the decade. If you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, those are the two men, Sacco and Vanzetti. I believe Vanzetti is the mustached one of the two. But that's the two of them photographed at the time while they were undergoing their trial after they had been arrested. After or around the same time, concurrently, I should say, immigration became a real hot-button issue in America, much like immigration has become a hot-button issue in American politics today. It was a significant issue in the beginning of the 1920s, and a lot of the same concerns that people have today or have expressed in contemporary America were concerns that were expressed during the beginning of the 1920s. Congress passed a couple of pretty significant immigration bills. The first one was the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, and it basically limited the immigration of European immigrants to 3% of that nationality's total U.S. population as of the 1910 census. So, for example, only 3% of the total number of Italian Americans from the 1910 census, only 3% of whatever that number was, as far as people wanting to immigrate to the U.S. from Italy in 1922, the U.S. would only take 3% of the total number of Italian Americans on the record in the census from 10 years earlier. And that applied for all of the European countries with regards to their immigration. So it set a very small percentage of immigrants. It in effect established a quota for immigrants from specific countries. That would be expanded 3 years later when the National Origins Act of 1924 was passed, and this legislation specifically created quotas for immigrants that were entirely based on nation of origin, country of origin. And they went even further back with the National Origins Act to the 1890 census. So only 2% of the population of immigrants from foreign countries, based on that country's total number of immigrants from 1890, were allowed in. So in other words, using the previous example, if you were an immigrant from, say, Poland or Russia, trying to get into the U.S. in 1925, the U.S. would only take a total of 2% of whatever the population of Poles or Russians that were already in the country in 1890. So it drastically limited the amount of immigrants that could come into the U.S. It was designed to do that. Frankly, it was designed to reduce the number of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Also, it was designed to limit immigration from Latin America and Asia. In fact, Asians were prohibited from immigrating to the U.S. after the National Origins Act of 1924 was passed. But Latin American residents, particularly from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, continued to come to the U.S. after the National Origins Act was passed. And essentially what this boiled down to, similar to what it boils down to today, was fear of immigrants, fear of how that might change the complexion of the country, both literally in terms of the racial and ethnic diversity of the country, and also from a philosophical standpoint, from an ideological standpoint as well. As I mentioned, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe were distrusted by many white Americans who were wary of either their political ideologies or perhaps their religion. If they were Catholic, white Protestant Americans didn't trust them. Jewish immigrants were also discriminated against during this time and were not trusted by the majority of white Protestant America. But the overall design was to limit the amount of immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe and from Latin America and Asia, and to enhance the number of immigrants coming from Northern Europe and Western Europe, countries like the UK and France. Because if you think about it, the 1890 census, there were quite a few American citizens who had immigrated from those Northern European countries, as opposed to the Eastern and Southern European countries that came in the subsequent decades. When Calvin Coolidge signed the National Origins Act during the early days of his presidency in 1924, he proclaimed that America must be kept American. That was his direct quote. America must be kept American. Again, if you take a look at some of the immigration rhetoric today, for the folks that want to limit or restrict immigration through whatever method they choose, they couch their argument in similar terminology, similar rhetoric as what Coolidge used to describe the reasoning for the legislation way back in 1924. So, with that nativism in mind, and with the amidst the backdrop of a fear of immigrants and a fear of foreign-born Americans that from countries that were non-white. These elements served as the basis for the growth and expansion of the Ku Klux Klan after it was relaunched, if you will, in 1915. We discussed this a little bit with the Tulsa Race Riot, or Tulsa Race Massacre, I should say, of 1921 in a recent lecture. But that the release of the film "The Birth of a Nation" in 1915 generated a lot of sympathy for the original Ku Klux Klan and prompted William J. Simmons to reorganize the Klan and restart the Klan. Another significant event that contributed to Simmons' decision to restart the Klan was the lynching of Leo Frank. If you're unfamiliar with that, I won't get into too much detail of it here, but basically in the Atlanta, Georgia area, there was a young girl, believe she was a teenager or perhaps maybe preteen. I think she was 14 or 15 years old at the time. I'm not 100% sure. But she was found raped and murdered. And Leo Frank, who was a Jewish factory worker, was the suspect. He was linked to the rape and murder of Mary Fagan. That was the girl's name. In subsequent years, the evidence indicates that Leo Frank was most likely not the killer or the perpetrator of this crime, but Leo Frank was the original accused perpetrator of the crime, and he was a Jewish American citizen living and working in a factory job in the Deep South in 1915, and as a result, he was lynched for the crime. So that case generated a lot of media coverage and attention. That, along with the Birth of the Nation release, led to a renewed enthusiasm for a rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, which happened when Simmons organized a rally of the Klan and to recruit members in the fall of 1915. This second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan differed from the original version of the Klan in certain ways. If you recall in our discussion of Reconstruction, the inaugural Ku Klux Klan, founded in the 1860s in the Deep South, largely consisted of, for lack of a better term, poor white Southerners who lived in the rural communities of the South, who basically were anti-African Americans and couldn't accept and wouldn't accept the advancement of African Americans through the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th and 15th Amendment, and seeing the political and economic and social advancement of African Americans, especially African American men, during the late 1860s and the 1870s was simply too painful for the members that formed the first version of the KKK to deal with, and that's why they formed the Klan and terrorized black Southerners throughout the Reconstruction era. But that version of the Klan, the original Ku Klux Klan, was pretty specific to as an anti-African American organization, anti-black. that was the basis of their violence and their opposition. But this go around, they had expanded their bigoted platform. It wasn't just solely focused on African Americans, but also focused on anybody that wasn't 100% American. That was the specific terminology used by the second incarnation of the Klan. That meant, in addition to African Americans, the Klan opposed Catholics, Jews, any immigrants from Latin America or Asia, anybody that had any sort of radical political beliefs, I should say. Simply put, the goal of the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan was to transform America into a nation of white Protestants of Anglo-Saxon ancestry that fought for and defended quote-unquote traditional American values. Basically, they wanted to, in many ways, restore America to what the country was from a demographic standpoint, from a racial, ethnic, social standpoint, pre-Civil War, pre-1840s, 1850s. So with this expanded list of others, and when I say others, I mean that was a tactic that was used by the Klan back then, and it's been used by any organization that practices in, engages in, or promotes bigotry today. They find a reason to take specific individuals or members of a specific group and paint them as something other than the majority group, and as such, they are not to be trusted. They are not to be granted equality from a social or political or economic standpoint. Whether we're talking about African Americans or Latin Americans or Asian Americans or Jewish Americans or anybody that doesn't sort of fit into this neat white Protestant Anglo-Saxon America, and particularly white Protestant Anglo-Saxon America, who really are serious about their Christian faith. That was acceptable, and pretty much everybody else was not. In short, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s did not want a multicultural America in any way, shape, or form. That's probably the best and most succinct way that I can state it for you. But as a result of this sort of widespread list of groups that they opposed, the second version of the Klan expanded in popularity and in membership beyond the rural South, and they gained members in states throughout the Midwest and the West and parts of the Northeast as well. It was not just a Southern thing. It was not just a small town rural thing. It was widespread and pervasive during the first half of the 1920s. Some historians have estimated that as many as 4 million Americans held membership in the Klan by the mid-20s. Other historians have argued that it's even more than that it's perhaps as much as 6 million Americans. But it was a very large and significant number of people that joined the Klan during the 1920s. And as a result of their numbers, the Klan gained quite a bit of political influence. And it's important to note that this second version of the Klan, I mentioned that they weren't rural Southerners who came from impoverished background. many of them were middle-class folks in terms of their socioeconomic status and the jobs or occupations that they held in their respective communities. For example, Nancy McLean, who's a very prominent historian, one of her books is about the origins of the second version of the Ku Klux Klan. The book is called Behind the Mask of Chivalry. And in that work, McLean reveals that in the Athens, Georgia chapter of the second version of the Klan in the 1915, or the latter part of the 19-teens and the early 20s, that the Athens, Georgia chapter of the Klan during that period, amongst its membership, included local lawyers as well as high-ranking officers in the Athens Police Department. These were not just fringe racist crazies that had no standing in their individual communities. Political candidates throughout the South and other areas where the Klan was popular, including Indiana, for example, sought endorsements from the local chapter of the Klan in wherever, in whatever campaign they were running, state, local, federal. Or at the very least, if they couldn't get an endorsement, they sought to try to prevent the Klan from opposing their candidacy. So what can I do to avoid any sort of outward criticism by the Klan? These are what political candidates in the early to mid 1920s sought as they were running for office. And I mentioned the large numbers of the Klan during this time period. These folks were fairly open about membership in the Klan. They had a number of public events, rallies, parades, other large gatherings, picnics, festivals, anything you can think of that was a public event or gathering that would attract members of a community or a city. The Klan was involved, or the Klan held its own gatherings in that same sort of area around the same time. So these were people that were not just going around secretly and burning crosses and remaining relatively anonymous within their communities. They were out and about and open. However, in the second half of the decade, the Klan's influence and membership numbers began to decline. Part of this was due to the results of the National Origins Act of 1924. Immigration slowed considerably in America because the restrictions were so tight. So it was harder for the Klan to rally folks around anti-immigrant status when it appeared, both in terms of the rhetoric of politicians of the era as well as the declining numbers of immigrants coming in, that the immigration issue had been solved, or at least had been solved to the satisfaction of ordinary Americans that had been extraordinarily concerned and worried about the demographic and trends of America at the beginning of the decade. In addition to the passage of the National Origins Act, there were a number of acts of violence that attracted attention, high-profile acts of violence committed by individual Klan members or individual Klan chapters. And the organization had used as a recruiting pitch this idea that they would defend the morals and virtues of a community, defend the morals of, or defend the virtue of white women in particular. But it's hard to argue that that you are a moral organization or that you have any sort of claim to a moral high ground when you're committing acts of violence. And as a result, the membership numbers of the Klan declined precipitously in the later years of the 1920s, and by the early 1930s, nationwide membership in the Ku Klux Klan numbered at approximately 30,000, from a high of somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 million in 1923, 1924, 1925, in that area, in that range. If you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, that I mentioned that the Klan was open. This is a march on Washington by the Ku Klux Klan, a national march in the early 1920s. I'm uncertain as to what year that is, but I think it was around 1923 or 1924. You can see obviously the Capitol dome in the background, and you see the gentlemen at the front of this alignment. Their hoods are up, and their faces are visible. I mentioned that these folks were open and sort of proud of their membership in the Ku Klux Klan of that time. But as I mentioned, by the early 1930s, the Klan's membership would decline precipitously, and it would remain low and insignificant until the 1950s and the 1960s, when the civil rights movement unfolded over the course of a decade plus, and all of a sudden the Klan was active again and out and open again and recruiting new members in the post-World War II era. We will get to that later this semester. So that'll wrap up today's lecture, and we will conclude the 1920s and look ahead into the 30s with our final lecture of the week on Friday.